Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about a tale of perseverance against all odds that resulted in both artistic and individuated triumph. And this, of course, is the story of Meatloaf, Bad Out of Hell, his debut album that really came out of left field and took the world by storm. Now, the album came out in 77, but the initial writing and conceptualization dates back to 1975 when Meatloaf partnered with Jim Steinman, a songwriter from a Broadway tradition, but someone who was, in Meatloaf's own words, an encyclopedia of music of every genre. And they were working on this project together. Meatloaf was a singer of the stage and screen. He was a singing actor, and he had a relatively medium-sized role, let's say, in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was a cult classic then and a cult classic now. But he wanted to enter the music business as a singing rock star rather than a singing actor. And this got him loft out of many, many record label offices. He was called an actor who can't make a rock album. Jim Steinman was called, a Broadway pianist who didn't know anything about rock and roll. They were literally rejected from every label, the big ones and the medium ones, because in the 70s there were medium ones. But no one wanted Meatloaf. No one wanted this concept. No one wanted this album. And it was a very depressing experience for Meatloaf in particular. Jim Steinman tended to take it a bit better, but it couldn't have been easy for him either. And the person that really came in to save the day was Todd Rundgren, because he ended up producing the album. He ended up spending a lot of his own money getting it made. He used the members of his band Utopia, great band, by the way, to play on it, as well as Max Weinberg on drums from Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band, and in later years of the Conan O'Brien Band. Um, and it was a wonderfully conceptualized album. It was kind of a rebel without a cause, updated for the surrealistic filmmaking of the 70s, because it was a very cinematic album, as many concept albums are, but this one in particular. So it was sort of Dungeons and Dragons meets James Dean meets doo-wop meets traditional classic pop meets sort of heartland rock. This interesting combination with a lot of progressive rock elements thrown in because of the songwriting itself and because of Todd Rundgren's influence. He played a wonderful guitar solo on the album, by the way. And the whole thing was really great. And when it was made, no one wanted to hear it in terms of record labels. No one knew what the hell it was. And for the artists involved, that was actually a plus. Todd Rundgren wasn't sure if this was meant to be sort of a straight concept album to be taken seriously, or whether it was, in his words, some sort of parody of Bruce Springsteen. So, Bruce Springsteen, white t shirt, leather jacket, straightforward lyrics about life in New Jersey. And this was just something like an outrageous version of it. And Todd wasn't quite sure if it was intentionally weird or otherwise. But since Todd liked his weird, he ended up loving the project, and his influence on it was, in my view, completely positive. Without him, it may have never been made. And so eventually it got on Cleveland Records, which was like a subsidiary of Epic, and no one really thought it was going to sell much. People who were involved in financing this were just hoping to break even. Instead, it became one of the biggest albums of all time. Alongside Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Michael Jackson's Thriller, Meatloaf, Bad Out of Hell is always named as one of the top selling albums of all time. And it still gets a lot of streams. And in terms of physical sales, it still actually sells. It never really stopped selling, never been out of print. And this was such a triumph because this was the album that no one thought the world needed. In the late 70s, what did you have? Well, on North American radio, you had either AOR or you had what the commercial version of R&B known at the time as disco. You had other things to be sure, but those were the biggest categories. And this didn't really fit into any of them, nor did it even fit into sort of the existing sort of prog rock stuff. Some would say that it was kind of like Queen, but again, Queen were already an established band. Um, and so there was really nothing quite like it. Because while Queen were a rock band with very melodramatic tendencies because of Freddie Mercury's flamboyance, this was people who were literally coming from the Broadway world being rock stars. And everyone in the labels hated it, but the people loved it. It became not only a big hit in the US and Canada, but all over the world. Everyone around the world bought this album. They loved the album. And there was this wonderful combination of sort of the innocent sing along ethos of a 1950s rock and roll flavored pop song, but with all of the surrealism of 70s filmmaking and 70s stage productions, with all of the great production of 70s prog rock that was typical of Todd Rundgren. So, very much wall of sound, all of the faders up, distortion, and sort of an overall feeling more important than detail. And it just really, really worked for this album. Now, Meatloaf continued to record a lot of good albums in the 80s, albeit none of them had the success of this. He was a bit personally burnt out after Bad Out of Hell, but he continued to record. And I would actually say that the best album he came out with in the 80s was one from 86, and this was called Blind Before I Stop. This was him not trying to replicate this sound of Bad Out of Hell with people other than Jim Steinman, as he was sort of trying to do before, because they had an artistic falling out. Um, these things happen. But the reason that Blind Before I Sleep was so good was that it was Meatloaf doing something else, singing in a different style, a much more 80s style production with all that goes along with drum machines, Simmons heads, the modern synths of the day, less guitar heavy. And I think it really worked. And the producer is someone whose name you might remember because it was produced by Frank Farian. Now, he was the man behind Boney M, who were more about theatrics than about the music, because the real singers weren't really the singers. No one really cared, but he was also the producer of a band with fake singers, and people really cared, and that was Milli Vanilli. But he also worked with real musicians. He worked with people like Steve Lukather, a very real musician. He worked with Meatloaf, a man who really, really could sing both live and in the studio. And I think it was a really good album. Meatloaf's name, it was a bit out of fashion, and so he decided to go back to his theatrical roots and he got into acting. He was doing a lot of parts in TV and film, and things were going pretty good in the late 80s and early 90s. And then something happened all over again. He and Jim Steinman decided in the early 90s to pick up where they left off. The idea was always to do a conceptual and musical sequel to Bad Out of Hell. And in the early 90s, they did just that. And, deja vu all over again. None of the labels wanted it. This was the early 90s. This was the era of Pearl Jam and Nirvana. This was the era of Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre. And here these guys are saying, if you thought that this highly theatrical album was crazy in 1977, boy, have I got something you'll love. And no one in the industry wanted it. Eventually, it got a label behind it and it became absolutely huge. Pretty much as big as the first one. Everyone loved it. It was a huge, huge seller. And it was proof that in any era, whether in the era of Donna Summer and Journey or in the era of Nirvana and Dr. Dre, people worldwide had this appetite for what Jim Steinman and Meatloaf did when they worked together. And again, one of the reasons that I like telling this story is because Meatloaf was such a nice guy. He was your down to earth guy who loved football, loved baseball, just a regular big guy. And yet he had this wonderful voice and this wonderful flair for the stage. And if anyone doubts that his voice really was his voice, look at a rendition he did of the Star Spangled Banner at an MLB All-Star game in I think 93 or 94, right around the time of Bat Out of Hell 2. And this is, I think, along with Whitney Houston's famous Super Bowl rendition, the finest ever rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. It's just Meatloaf with a pianist, all live, pitch perfect. The guy could sing. And he continued to sing. Once Spot Out of Hell 2 came out, everything he did from there on out was considered pretty good, because by now he established himself as a legacy act, but someone with a foot in two musical eras. And so he released more albums, but more importantly, he toured and he toured and he toured. Towards the end, he was having issues of, I think he collapsed on stage and things were getting tough, and he eventually died a few years back. But his tale of perseverance against the record industry is one that I think is super inspirational. And what it also shows is the record labels don't know what people want, only people know what they want. And when you've got a vision and really believe in it and produce it well, you're going to find an audience for it. Bat Out of Hell was always going to be big, but no one, including Meatloaf and Jim Steinman, knew just how big. Just goes to show you. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.